There we go. So welcome everyone. We're delighted to have Jessie Castle and Gillian O'Brien join us today in Nano Nagle Place to learn about the incredible sources that they used when creating the exhibition Changing Habits, 250 Years of Convent Life, which is now on display in Nano Nagle Place until November. So do pop in and see it whenever you get the chance. So Jessie and Gillian are going to discuss the background to the exhibition today and show some of the artifacts that they used to help frame the stories that are told. So thank you so much for joining us today, Jessie and Gillian, and I'll hand over to you. And I'm going to start with this now as well, so you will be spotlighted. Thanks, guys.
Okay, so I'm invisible, but I'm hoping people can hear me.
We can hear you.
Okay, so I'm going to start by asking Jessie and Gillian some questions, but we would really like to invite questions from the floor. So we're going to do a kind of a structured Q&A, but please be thinking about what you'd like to ask. And because it's a webinar, the best thing to do is to drop those questions into the Q&A box. So I'll be watching out for questions. So Jessie and Gillian, thank you for being here. So the first question to ask is, what is the exhibition about?
Well, the exhibition is about 250 years of convent life on this site, which is a site which has had a number of different convents on the site and two orders who have lived on the site. But it's a convent that has been in continuous use for 250 years, which makes it unique in Ireland.
And I suppose in this exhibition, the temporary exhibition that's on now called Changing Habits, we had a chance to really dig into the life of the people who lived on the site over 250 years and really look at the details of their life, where they lived, what they wore, what they ate, who lived here, who was coming and going, and really to look at those lovely details of the life here over the last 250 years, bringing it right up to the present day and Nano Nagle Place today.
Brilliant. So who has lived in the South Presentation Convent over the past 250 years?
I'll answer that. Well, the first convent that was on the site here was here for 50 years, and it was the Ursuline order who lived in the first convent building that Nano Nagle funded and built for the Ursulines, who she brought over from Paris. And they lived here for 50 years until they moved out to a much bigger building in Blackrock in 1825. And at that point, the Presentation Sisters, who had been founded by Nano Nagle and had been living just down the road over the wall, really on Douglas Street, moved up into these buildings. And they have been the occupiers and owners of these buildings right up until today. And as well as the sisters who lived in the convent, there were also pupils who came to the day schools here. There were boarding girls who came while the Ursulines lived here. They had boarding pupils. They started with 12, but the school grew very quickly. There were the servants who lived here, the gardeners who tended the grounds, there were delivery people, messengers, a lot of people coming in and out of the site. So it was really quite a busy place, although it was an enclosed order. Really, from day to day, people were coming and going all the time, and it would have been a really busy place.
Okay, so a busy place, but both of the orders who lived in the convent were enclosed orders. What does that mean?
Well, the rule of enclosure meant that those who were living within the convent grounds, that included the gardens, that they weren't allowed to leave the site. So, and visitors were not allowed beyond the parlours. So any visitors that came into the convent could only go as far as the sort of visiting parlours, and everywhere else was sort of kept only for those who were living, or those sisters and nuns who were living on site. So once they'd entered, unless for exceptional reasons they were not allowed to leave the convent enclosure. So the Ursulines were enclosed from the beginning, from when they arrived in Cork in the 1770s, and the Presentation Sisters become enclosed a little bit later. And the enclosure rules were very strict, and they're outlined in the rule books associated with convents, and they were really excellent sources for us. So there's a whole range. So I have in front of me here, this is, I don't know whether you can see that clearly, but this is the original rules on constitutions of the Sisters of the Congregation Charitable Instruction, which are better known as the Presentation Sisters. And this one, if you can see, I think it'll appear backwards on the screen, but this one here is handwritten. So you can see the rules that they were following, which are handwritten rules. And then later, those rules are expanded and you find the sort of printed versions like this one here. And on display, we have a later version from
and a more extensive version.
Yeah, so they get much bigger. But in this one, which is from 1809 on the rules of enclosure, it says the religious sisters of this new institute, so well calculated for the Christian education and improvement of poor girls in particular, to which they are bound by vow to attend, always remembering that in consecrating themselves to God in this holy state, they have totally renounced the world, shall hold themselves obliged to a strict, exact, and faithful observance of enclosure, so that having made the religious profession, it shall no longer be in their power to pass the limits of enclosure, which shall be marked out, except for such weighty reasons as are assigned in the sacred canons and apostolical constitutions. So once you have become a fully professed nun, you were to remain within the grounds, which are, because it's in a city, they're not huge in this instance, but there were beautiful gardens that were then laid out, which the sisters could use.
Okay, so you've shown some of the sources, but what sources were available to you for your research?
Well, we're really lucky in that we have two very extensive archives to draw information from. So the Ursuline Order have their own archive, much of which is kept in Blackrock and was made available to us. And as I said before, they lived here for the first 50 years, so that information was available for the very early life on the convent here. And then after that, we have the congregational archives that are housed here in Nano Nagle Place, and really contain so much information about the life here over all those years. I think two of the most useful sources to us initially were the annals, which were kept by both friends and the Presentation Order. So the annals record all the main and important events from the very beginning of the foundation of their convents, and they were kept throughout the whole period. Gillian, can you talk a little bit about those?
Yeah, annals which are kept by every convent are a great source of knowledge about what happens, not so much on a day-to-day basis, but sort of all of the big events, all of the Reverend Mothers, all of the novice mistresses, all of those sort of significant individuals within convent life, they're all named. You get stories about them, you understand stories about the schools, and they give a really good sort of structure for how a convent has developed over time. And then we had additional sources which give much more detailed day-to-day information, like the account books, which are an absolute treasure trove of information.
Yeah, so one of the main documents that we used to really explore the presentation convent life on the site is this huge account book that we have here, which is kept in the congregational archives, and it's begun in 1824. So at that time, the Presentation Sisters were still living in their smaller convent, just over the wall from here on Douglas Street. And they moved here actually in 1827. So the Ursuline Order moved to Blackrock in 1825. And it was where the Presentations moved up into these buildings. And one of the reasons for that was that they needed to carry out quite a lot of work on the buildings that had become quite run down at that point, we understand from references to them in the annals. And the account book is quite simple initially, but after they move up to the bigger premises here, it becomes very detailed. So from 1827, they really begin to split their accounts under a lot of different headings. They have an account of clothes, they have an account of shoes and mending, they have an account of the coal they bought, the beer and the wine that they purchased, all their provisions and food, and any expenses that were paid to people, for example. So just to give you a few examples, because they're really great and they really, I think, give a very good insight into life at the time. So the convent here was made up of several buildings that had been joined together. It was extended over the years. Nano Nagle's initial convent of 1771 was quite small. The Ursulines immediately built a wing and then a larger wing which overlooked the garden. So all of these buildings and all the rooms in the buildings would have been heated by open fires, and it seems that in the fireplaces was coal. And just to give an example of how much coal they went through, the account book tells us that in September of 1832, the Presentation Sisters paid for 22 tons of coal and the expenses of watching and putting it in. So they paid for the coal, they had to pay for the carriage, the delivery, and then they paid people then to look over it until it was all loaded and stored safely away on the convent grounds. So it's 22 tons of coal. It's really a huge amount. And sort of gives an indication, I suppose, of the extent of the buildings here at that time. We know that they expanded their gardens as well, and I suppose that they were quite thrifty in a way, because the garden accounts show that they want to put some of the flower garden aside for growing their own potatoes. They also grew cauliflowers, cabbages. And at one point in the early 1830s, we realized that from the account book that they also had a cow. So their account books record paying for hay for the cow, planting hay in the garden that they could then cut to feed the cow, and for building a little cow house. And around they began to stop paying for milk in the account books, because they're actually providing their own milk by having the cow on site. So these little details of life appear as you look through the account book. They also kept accounts of the beer and wine that they drank, which would have been very common at the time, of course. It wasn't unusual. They would have followed the diet of everybody else that period of time. And they kept very detailed accounts of clothes as well. And clothes referred to both items of clothing, but also fabric that they bought for making the clothes. And it's really important because it details exactly what type of fabrics they were buying and what they were buying it for. So for example, they paid for pieces of serge for the habits. And for this exhibition, we had an idea that we would like to remake a set of traditional habits exactly as would have been worn by the sisters in the early period of the convent. And these account books really helped us to identify exactly what fabrics were used and how those habits were put together. So, you know, this account book is really extensive. It also keeps detailed accounts of house expenses. And from that, for example, you know, that the sisters use snuff because it's recorded as being paid for on a very regular basis. But it also records all the repairs and sort of everyday maintenance that were carried out to the buildings. And it's really interesting as it shows, it gives a lot of detail that would have been hard to imagine without having them. So we know what rooms were wallpapered rather than painted. We know how often they whitewashed the exteriors of the buildings. You know, we have all the little details about paying for items for the kitchen, for the classrooms, for the girls, what the beds were made of, what fabric was used to hang the curtains around the bed. All of those little pieces that illustrate the life of the convent at that time can be found in this account book. So it was really invaluable to us in the research in the exhibition.
Yeah, I think it's the layers that you can get, because one of the difficulties is of individuals, because when the nuns joined, the story was really about kind of the convent life in general, and it's hard to pick out individual stories, but using the annals, the account books, and sort of the rules and constitutions, you get an idea of what life was like for individuals within the convent. I think one of the things that really caught our attention when reading some of the rules was there's a piece on the employment of time, and one of the things that you weren't allowed to do or be in the convent was you weren't allowed to be idle, and it was specifically outlined in the rules. And it said, and this is from the 1809 when it changes slightly kind of over time, it says, as idleness according to the Holy Ghost teaches much evil, and as we must render an account in judgment of every moment of our precious time, the sisters shall be careful never to indulge idleness. Wherefore, whatsoever time they may have to spare from the functions of the Institute, they shall diligently employ in manual works or such other corporal or spiritual occupations as the Mother Superior shall appoint. They shall never be found running giddily through the convent, but shall always and in all places preserve in their deportment a gravity religious persons. So there's sort of no nuns racing through convents. You're always to walk at a sort of moderate pace, no matter how rushed you are. And all of those, I think, when you build up all of that sort of information together, you begin to get a sense of what it was like to be in a convent, in really up until quite recently.
There's two questions that have come from the floor that pertain to what you were just talking about. One of them is from Victoria Kingston, and she's asking, is it hard to get ordinary voices of individuals within the order?
Yes, I think is the answer. And one of the things is that of all the objects that we were looking at, none of them are owned personally. So they were owned sort of collectively. So finding personal belongings, except in later years when people tend to have some personal belongings, but generally speaking, all of the material culture is owned kind of collectively. So you get some stories, particularly the annals are particularly good at when a sister dies, there is sort of an obituary written in the annals. So you do learn about the sisters there. And I think we've read a lot of annals, not just from South Pres, but from a lot of other convents, and you do get a sense of the personalities who are writing the annals and as they change. So when you read them over time, you really get a sense of who's writing them and what takes their particular interest. But it is difficult to tell individual stories in great detail, I think.
Yeah, there are no personal records. Sisters who lived here, for example, they didn't keep personal diaries, or I mean, possibly there are letters somewhere that we have seen that sisters may have written to relatives, etc., from here at that time. But the annals are very much about the life of the convent, and they do sort of pick out individual people, especially maybe the more remarkable sisters. When they die, they're remembered for particular things, and you get a sense of them, but that's somebody else writing about them. So you don't get a personal voice. It was really a collective.
And Victoria Ann Pearson has just asked, how did the sisters fare with their consumption of beer and wine with Father Matthew as their chaplain?
Well, it's not mentioned in the annals, but they were very firm supporters of Father Matthew, and I'll show you one of the objects associated with him.
I mean, very specifically, there is actually a change in the account over the course of the 19th century, and so while they continued to drink beer and wine, the harder spirits that you might have found in the earlier account books. So there is mention of brandy, whiskey, Methglin, which is a sort of spiced mead that was quite strong. But the spirits seem to be done away with, and I presume that was,
except for invalids, like they kept getting brandy.
Yes, there was brandy, as a medicine is specified, but so I think they did moderate that under the influence of government.
So the Presentation Sisters are no longer an enclosed order, and their way of life is very different. How did you find out about life in the convent before the 20th century changes took place?
I suppose Jenny's given some good examples now. The rules and constitutions that really specified how life was to be lived within the convent, and they were written specifically for every convent. So while the Presentation Sisters would have shared very common rules, I think they were sort of slightly modified, or at least the editions were published for the house. By later on in the 19th century, those that directory and the rules and constitutions become very, very specific. So they give details about how every hour of the day or 15 minutes of the day was to be used, what time you woke up in the morning, what time meals were held. There were a lot of rules and specifications about teaching in the schools, about how the habit was to be made, what length the skirt was to be, what depth the sleeves were to be, really, really specific information. So those rules, I think, were adhered to quite strictly until the 20th century. They really did give us a lot of information.
Yeah, I mean, right up until Vatican II, I think those rules give you a very clear indication of how life was lived in the convent. Really, as Jessie said, right almost down to the minute.
And do the rules change? I mean, Nano's convent isn't enclosed and there are no habits. And then there is this change. So one of the biggest, earliest changes is around, is it 1800 or 1805? Does the rule book get thicker?
Yes. Yeah, so this is a 1790. This rule book here is 1790. You can see it's very slim, and that's pre-enclosure. And this one is just post-enclosure. And one of the reasons they went for enclosure at the early part of the 19th century was because it was very difficult to attract young women to join, and they thought that there would be more chance of young women joining if they were in closed order. So even though that wasn't Nano Nagle's wish, that is something that happens at the beginning of the 19th century, and really up until Vatican II happens, when the religious orders are, encouraged to go back and look at what their founders' ideal and vision was. And when the Presentation Sisters looked at that, the founder's vision was to be out among the people and not to be enclosed. And at that point, the Presentation Sisters begin to become more sort of outward looking and being out among people and leaving the rule of enclosure behind. That said, still buildings like this would not have had the general public coming into it, because they were still kind of places where very few people would come beyond the parlours, except possibly close family and friends. And so, I think with the opening of Nano Nagle Place as a place, for everyone to come in, you actually get to see sort of behind the scenes of, 250 years of convent life that way.
Okay, and so have many personal items or objects survived from the earlier years of convent life in Southcoast?
In terms of personal items, I mean, there were objects used by individuals, but they would then, potentially be passed down, or they would go, they would have continuous use, not just by individuals. So we found, and the material culture of a convent, because people don't own personal things, there's not the same sort of emotional attachment that you might find in a general house. And so we're really lucky here that quite a few things have been kept. So there are objects for us to show, and I guess that help tell the story. And there's some great material culture objects, I think, that we sort of use in the exhibition.
Yeah, we have a few things that we could show. Maybe, do you want to show the?
So this is something that regulated a lot of life in a convent. So I'm not sure, actually. I need to put on gloves. You could talk about it while
I can. It was used in the chapel. So the sisters didn't wear a watch, and there was not in the early days a clock in the chapel. So these little timers, referred to as meditation timers, they're 15 minutes.
Yeah.
They would have timed out the length of time for prayer, for meditation, for.
They were also used in the refectory or the dining hall at meal times, because meal times were largely silent, but one nun would read from a designated book, generally religious, either not necessarily from the Bible, but Lives of the Saints or something like that. And they would read for 15 minutes. So these timers, and there are a number of them. There is one on display, and then there's this, but there are a number of them in these. They're not fancy, but they're extremely practical, and they really did sort of, eke out time every day. These, they're all 15 minutes. So that was very much a time of prayer and reflection through convent life, really, for that period.
Yes, and there are some items that would have been worn with the habit as well. So each presentation sister wore a small silver ring. They're on display in the exhibition. We don't have everything here because we have quite a lot of objects on display as part of the changing habit. And they would have had a rosary and a cincture, which came home from the cincture belt, very large ones, and they hung and they were worn with the habit. We have one little item here. It's a little silver and enameled cross. Now, this was worn post Vatican II on what we refer to as the transitional habit, which was just after the time they stopped wearing the full, very formal habit, which had, a very a reinforced linen or later plastic celluloid piece across the breast, like a breastplate, which is known as a gowne, a very heavy serge habit. a veil, a bandeau, very formal habit which they had worn really from the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. They wore a sort of more practical form of this, I suppose, during the 70s, when each convent was allowed to design their own habit, and they initially wore pieces associated with the traditional habit, but they had changed the form of it slightly. And at that time, they wore, as part of their habit, they wore a very large silver cross here in South Pres, with a little enamelled Virgin Mary on the front. It's made of silver, it's really big, and it was worn around the neck over a little black cape that was worn over the dress of the habit. It wasn't a long period of time, but it keeps a little sort of window on that transitional period between the old enclosure times and the more modern life of the presentation systems.
I think one of the most exciting finds for us, which we have photographs of it on display, but we don't have the actual object, is in the Ursuline archive. There's a nun doll, and the nun doll is about 18 inches high, and she dates back from the 1770s, when she was brought over by the original Ursuline sisters who came to Cork. And the purpose of a nun doll and the presentation, this was within the rule books of both the Ursuline and the presentation orders, was that that doll was dressed in the habit of the order. And the purpose of that was that as different convents opened for each of the orders, a nun doll would be sent to the new convent, so that the new nuns in that convent would know how to put on the habit correctly. And this was important. You couldn't get assistance from somebody else, so you could sort of look at the nun doll and see how the order's habit was to be worn, and then you would replicate that in yourself. And if the habit was changed over time, a new habit would be sent out for the nun doll. And these were really precious items, because the bursar in each convent, which was one of the elected positions in the convent, was given charge of that nun doll, and that nun doll had to be kept under lock and key because it was so precious. And so they're extremely rare, and it was just great that we could find it and photograph it and be able to put that on display. And that was a really great source for us to be able to use.
And they haven't survived from anywhere else. That's the one to say that they were in every convent. No.
Yeah, and we've not found any other copies, and I've been in touch with a number of museum curators and checked out things, and we've not come across any from that period. There are other nun dolls from the 20th century of a lot of orders, but not those sort of teaching nun dolls dating back to the 18th.
And we suspect that possibly they may have been sent out when new convents, new houses were being established abroad, far afield, like India and Pakistan, and possibly those dolls were sent then sort of to show how the habit was to be made and within the rules of the houses at home. Possibly,
we're hopeful that others might be unearthed.
You mentioned that Father Matthew was the chaplain, and you have a very extraordinary item over to one side here that you might want to bring in.
Yeah, so it's rather large. I don't know if it can be seen. So this is a very large bell, and Father Matthew, who is obviously very well known in Cork and was very involved in the temperance movement, with the set up the Cork Total Abstinence Society in 1838. He was also the chaplain for the convent here through the 1840s until 1851. And the nuns were very involved, despite the fact they're buying beer and wine, but they were very involved in the temperance movement, and they made a number of banners, processions about the temperance movement, one of which is on display at the exhibition, and the other is on display in Cork Public Museum. And they're on silk, and they're very beautiful, painted silk banners. So they had a very close relationship with Father Matthew, and Father Matthew presented this enormous bell to the sisters of this convent in 1847. So he presented this sort of at the height of the famine, in addition to providing the sisters with flour and meal that he had sourced from America, that they were able to distribute around this area and amongst their students during the famine period. And so it has an inscription on it which says, humbly presented to the altar of the Church of Our Dear Lady, South Presentation Convent, Cork, by the Very Reverend Theobald Matthew, Christmas Day, 1847. And so this was used in the chapel for many years, in the chapel where the exhibition is now held. And it is something that was rather too large for us to actually put on display, but I think it shows, it's a very interesting piece of Cork history. It's an interesting piece of sort of Irish social and political history, and a really interesting piece associated with this particular convent that makes a very loud gong if you hit it. Can I? It's very satisfying. Oh.
It seems kind of extraordinary. I think that organ also dates from 1847 to make such massive investments at a time when the country was in a state of crisis.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons for that is that who else would save them but God? Was it, you know, so an investment in prayer. You see that quite a lot in a lot of areas, that, you know, when things are particularly bad, there was food was being provided to the children, but also there was an investment in devotion, because that might also help save people.
So we can invite any more questions from the floor now. And Victoria says, thank you both. So interesting to know personalities come through even in official records. And I suppose there are the obituaries that are in the annals, but they seem in the South Pres annals, they seem quite short. So is that the only window you get on individual personalities, really?
It is really, and some are recorded in more detail than others, and in the earlier annals they can also be recorded in more detail, especially if it was one of the founding sisters of the, you know, who had been first here in the Presentation Convent, likewise in the Ursuline annals, and if somebody had become superioress or had been particularly involved in running of the schools, or, you know, had made maybe a very big contribution, then they were recorded in more detail. But as I said before, it did depend on who the analyst was. So it may just have been that it was a very close friend of the analyst, for example, that it was recorded in more detail, because it does vary hugely.
You do get letters, so, you know, but it is a case of sort of piecing them all together. So there are letters in the Jesuit archive of, say, Father Matthew to some of the Ursuline sisters that give you some sort of indication, and also to some Presentation sisters. So you've got to follow through to a lot of different archives to try and collect as much as you can. So it is quite piecemeal to get those. But then there are some sisters like Sister de Pazzi, Magdalene de Pazzi Leahy, who you get a lot of information about, because she held a number of senior positions in this convent, and she was also responsible for writing most of the rule books of the mid-19th century, because what had happened was, as the Presentation order expanded, and it did so rapidly in the mid-19th century, there was a foundation opening every 2 to 3 years. They discovered that there were traditions happening in different convents and foundations as they expanded. So she wrote, and that's when you get the rule books becoming really big. And so we get quite a lot of information about her, because partly I think possibly because she wrote it about herself as well. But yeah, there are certain individuals that do kind of crop up time and time again. And I think we're really indebted to Sister Rosario, who collected so much of this information over decades through the late 20th century, and collated it and collected a lot of memories, so that we do have quite a treasure trove of information that she had.
South Presentation, I think, it is quite unusual, because it was the foundation house, and, you know, it was where Nano Nagle lived, and the foundation, you know, that she begun. That anything that belonged to her was very carefully looked after. You know, some belongings were with the Ursuline, some were with the Presentation orders, but her personal items that did remain were very much revered, and they were cared for and kept, and they were, you know, are seen as relics of Nano Nagle. And it's not at every convent where you would have such a big collection of items. You know, these go right back to the last part of the 18th century, and I think that's one of the reasons maybe why we have more survivals. And because, of course, the buildings have been lived in for 250 years, they continue to be lived in, and things have remained here in the convent that were always here. And so we're lucky that, you know, there is maybe an unusually large collection associated with this particular convent.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing, is attics are great. I think sort of get kept in some cases because material goods were not regarded as either personal possessions or particularly something that you shouldn't have sort of a particular fondness. But particularly in the 19th century, that those personal possessions should not be, you know, revered by one particular person, and that was so. Things did very often get thrown out, and I think we're just lucky that this has had continuous use as in its original form for so long, and that meant that, you know, quite a lot of things were kept.
Yeah, but in terms of items and personal things, and even things that would have been used in the house, you know, like sort of crockery and paintings and books, I mean, there is relatively little because of that, you know, lack of attachment to material things, and many of them were dispensed with over the years, whether they went back to the families of the sisters or whether they were passed along as gifts, or, you know, there isn't very much. So the items we do have are really sort of special and rare.
It's interesting that you're talking about the rule books as they pertain to South Pres, because I think once a convent, you know, is founded in another diocese, then the sisters are then under the kind of authority of that bishop. And South Pres wasn't a mother house like a Cistercian mother house where everybody had to follow exactly the same rules, was it? Does each convent start off trying to follow the rules, but can generate its own culture and slight changes to habits and things like that?
Possibly, I imagine that is the case, but how much of that is formally recorded is another story. I think there was probably, you know, quite a similar set of rules for the other convents, but I think that each convent had their own traditions and customs.
There were custom books for each convent, but they all did have to adhere to the same rule book. But there were different convents who have custom books, but they are limited in terms of the differences between them.
There were some traditions and customs, I think, which built up over the years in convents and were sort of passed down through the generations of sisters, and traditions around saint days, for example, you know, that sort of thing, and maybe slight modifications of habits, but they're not really formally recorded. I think officially they probably stuck to the same institutions, but
so notionally that printed rule book should be in every convent and it should be adhered to.
Well, from the 1850s, when Sister Magdalene de Pazzi Leahy, she specifically wrote her rule books to be sent to every foundation, because it was at that point, if you look at the annals, you'll see discussion about how there had been a sort of dispersal of tradition, and this was to bring it all together. So she does use these two rule books that we've just shown, but she expands it hugely, and that after that they were all supposed to adhere to the rule book that she was produced by her in the 1850s.
Okay. I'm just looking to see if there are any more questions from the floor. Not yet. Sister Rosario is here. Sister Rosario, do you have any questions?
no.
No, everything has been fully answered. I'll just do one more appeal for questions from then. If anybody would like to ask them, sometimes it takes people a minute to type them. I'm not seeing anything appearing. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us before we draw our session to a close?
I think, well, the only thing of the other objects that you can see on display are election beads, which we were very surprised to find, because there were 4 positions in a convent. There were 4 positions in a convent which were elected, and each one of those went through this election process, and there were like little beans, dried beans that you used, and they were black and they were white, and at each election boxes, and you put in a black bean or a white bean, depending on who you wanted to vote for. And it wasn't just for those positions, it was also for those nuns who were postulants and novices and ultimately professed. So you went through sort of a voting process where
a
your
for and
peers,
against.
yeah, a for and against.
I think the black bean was if you weren't in favour of that person, you know, progressing with their, you know, in the convent or being appointed to that position, and the white beans were if you were for election.
And all of that was done in silence, and it's really rare that we could find these election bean boxes and the election beans. They're not from South Presentation Convent, they're from another convent, but they sort of are something that represents, you know, the entirety of the 19th century and for the convents and that. And Sister Rosari has just lent me, I'm not sure if this can be seen, but this, we showed you the transitional cross earlier, and this is the ring that every presentation sister now wears. And so you can identify a presentation sister by the wearing of this ring, and there's also a brooch that many of them wear, either as a brooch or a necklace that has PBVM on it, which is the presentation of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And these rings, we have a number of these on display in the exhibition, and in many cases these rings will be passed on. So when a sister died, a new sister coming in would get that ring and would then wear that. So they're quite special, the rings that we have on display.
Okay, so we haven't had any further questions, so I think it's just time to thank you very much for your time today. Thank you to everyone who attended, and if you know people who have missed this session, it will be possible to catch it as we've recorded it, so it will be on our YouTube channel and on social media. So Gillian and Jessie, thank you so much. The Digital Repository of Ireland very much. I'm sure more thanks will come in next. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.